right, what up, communicators, and bienvenido to this lecture on nonverbal communication, because that's what we're going to talk about is like, how do our nonverbal expressions transmit meaning? And what does that actually mean? And how is that different from last week's video on verbal communication? And then, which one sends out more powerful message? So with that, let's get to it. So before we can really understand like how nonverbal communication expresses and transmits meaning, let's define it. So in our book, we define nonverbal communication as the intentional or unintentional transmission of meaning through an individual's non-spoken physical and behavior cues. What does that mean? I don't know. Here's what it means. It means that like our nonverbal communication is that messages that we're sending without words. So that can be anything from our hand gestures, the way that we're talking, like our eye contact, how close we are to somebody, how loud we're talking, all of that stuff sends a really loud message to people. And this nonverbal communication is both intentional and unintentional, because a lot of times like I'll be in a situation and I'm trying to act like I really care about what's going on and show people that I'm engaging in active listening. But if my nonverbals aren't actually matching that or aren't sending that message, everybody can see right through me and understand that this guy's not listening to me at all. And that's usually always the case with me. So let's figure out how we can make these a little bit better, how we can have our nonverbal communication match our verbal communication. So I think a good place to start would be, let's revisit verbal communication. So that definition of verbal communication, what that means is it's you communicating, sending a message, creating a message, and sending it using words. I think that's the big thing that you should have pulled out of last week's video and that chapter, was that when you communicate with language or words, that's verbal communication. And something that I always get hung up on is that idea of verbal. I think that it must be spoken, and it's not. It could be just typing or hand signal or sign language, all that stuff. And we think that that's the most powerful communication. In fact, I ask all my students when I'm face to face, which one do you pay more attention to, what people are saying or how they say it? And everybody will go with the words. And I think that's the most important way to communicate. But really go back and look at throughout your everyday interactions, what do you focus more on? And here's an example, and hopefully I haven't already done this in a video, but here it is. So little Brandon, little Brandon, when I was a wee little lad, that was horrible, but I'm not cutting it out. Anyways, when I was a little kid, I grew up with, 4 other brothers and sisters. And the greatest part about having a big family is that you don't get caught for anything. If you want to take a cookie, I just blame it on my brother and nobody's going to know. And so I did that all the time. I loved cookies. I still do. And now I just blame it on my kids. But anyways, when I was little, my mom always knew that it was me taking the cookie, and I couldn't ever understand how. I'd practice all my sayings, because I knew she'd always call me out, and I knew that she'd say, Brandon, did you take that cookie from the cookie jar? And then me, little Brandon, would, get all serious and wipe the cookies off my face, and I'd be like, heck no, I didn't. And walk away, trying to get out of it. And she'd always come back at me, and she'd say, you know what? It's like, look at me in the eyes and tell me whether or not you actually ate that. And I could never do that. I'd try to get as focused as I could and to really send that message. And she always saw right through me. And so that leads me to believe that even though my words were saying the right thing, actually it was the wrong thing because I really did take the cookie. But even though my words were saying that one way or one thing, she believed the other. And we do this all the time. So if somebody comes into your office, you're working, you're working hard, and they sit down, they throw all their stuff down on the desk and make a deep, and you look at them and you're just like, whoa, what's wrong with you? And they'll say, nothing. And that happens, all the time, whether it's at work or in your personal relationships. And you could just accept their words as is and be like, they said nothing's wrong, I'm going to move on. That's what I do. But that's probably not what you should do, because they're putting on a big show, by slamming their stuff down on the desk, making that big sigh. Even the way that they said that nothing's wrong is sending a message to you, a very loud and clear message that there is something wrong, and they want you to ask them about it because they're ready to talk. So pay attention to those nonverbals, because that's how what people are really telling you. And if you can read that stuff a lot better, like your conversations or your just relationships with people are just going to get so much better. So throughout each day, you communicate non-verbally in lots of different ways. So sometimes you may carefully consider your nonverbal communications, and other times you're not really paying attention to what you're actually doing. So one of the ways that you can become more competent communicators is to consider like all aspects of nonverbal communication and what makes it unique and distinguish it from your verbal expressions. So that's what we're going to go into as we look at four different characteristics of nonverbal communication. As we said, like our nonverbal messages, they're expressed through multiple channels, so different things. So they can be like sound, they can be visual, they're tactical. And when you're talking to a good friend, like, yeah, you're listening to their words, but you're also listening to their voice, like their tones. And you'll look at like their facial expressions, their eye contact, hand gestures, and then how they're touching. And you'll take all of that information to make sense of it, to really figure out like what are they trying to communicate with you. And I think if we can just really do that with everybody, that's what's going to improve our communications in general. But one of the problems with nonverbal communication is that the meanings are more flexible or more ambiguous than verbal communications, because like a simple smile, just like on, means so many different things. Like, I mean, especially and depending on like where I'm at when I do that smile, could mean a whole lot of things. So let's go back to that smile because my video stopped. I knocked over my green screen, and I don't remember where that. So just go back to the smile and ask yourself, like, like those smiles that you send to people like have tons of different meaning, and based off of how long I hold the smile, how deep my eye contact is, how close I am to you, all of that stuff changes or sends a different message to people. So here's another example. Say you're out with a friend and you're with a friend who is harboring some type of romantic feelings with you, and they give you a long extra hug. You could ask yourself, well, are they just being friendly, or are they sending some type of signal, some romantic signal or romantic interest in me? Like that hug could mean a whole lot of things. And the only way you're really going to know is if you ask them, which nobody does. But like you'll start trying to interpret the meaning behind that extended hug and figure out like what does that really mean? Because that's where you're trying to figure out, what are the intentions behind what they're actually doing. So I think one of the hard parts about nonverbal communication is it just doesn't have very many rules. There's no rule that says that smile means this, or how the way I stand, like how close I stand to you or how far away I am. Like that doesn't actually have a rule of like, it's not like 4 plus 4 is 5. That was a dumb joke. But anyways, it doesn't have those type of rules. You've always got to interpret like the meaning behind that. And so how do you do it? Well, I think the way that you do that is through like your experiences with that person and with other relationships that you have, like experience that type of communication. And the more you see people giving hugs or smiling, you'll start creating your own definition of what that nonverbal behavior actually means. When we interact with others, we often deduce more meaning from people's nonverbal communication than we do with their verbals at all, because we convey more meaning to them through our nonverbal rather than our verbal communication. For example, like if you're at a party and you're meeting somebody for the first time, you're really probably not listening too much to what they're saying. What you're looking at is their facial expressions, their eye contact, their posture, gestures, vocal tones, the clothing, because all of that stuff sends a message that allows you to interpret who they are and try to decide, do they fit within my same groups, my social setting groups, or are they an outside member? And I'm not really going to base that off of the things that they're saying. I'm looking at how they say it, and the clothing and things that they're wearing does send that message to me. It lets me understand, is this an attractive person, somebody that I want to keep having a communication with, or is this somebody that I'm going to reject just because I view them as so incredibly different than me? Unfortunately, that is actually true. We do that all the time. And the thing about our nonverbal communications is we rely on that type of communication so much more. Like really go back to pay attention to like just how you're interacting with other people and ask yourself, do you really put a lot of value on the words that they're saying, or is it how they say it? that's what you're really paying attention to. And I think that's probably the number one message that I'm trying to make stand out. I've said it a few different times, like your posture and all that stuff really is what people are going to put more focus in on. So I guess put more attention on that as you're communicating. I think that's why in your videos, I'll say, I can't really see you very well. And not that that really changes your grade, but it does. Because, like, are you really communicating the way you want to if I can't see what you're doing? Which is why we do all these videos rather than you just typing it, because we're trying to learn how to improve our overall communication, not just our writing. Keep this in mind. Your skill as a nonverbal communicator goes hand in hand with your skill as a verbal communicator. So you need to have both of them to communicate competently. And another way to enhance our competence as nonverbal communicators is to realize that there are significant influences, things like our culture, gender, technology, and these things are things that also come into play with how we're communicating, how others are perceiving our messages. So how is our nonverbal communication influenced by our culture? Well, it's because these things are linked together. Like your culture tells you, it gives you an idea of what those things mean. So when you wink or you use hand gestures or you speak too loudly to make, or you speak louder to make a point, people in different cultures might actually not understand that the same way. And same with like distance. So here's a story that I had with distance and proximity is that here in American culture, like we don't want to be close to people at all when we communicate. I think like that 6 foot rule of COVID, that was us just expressing like how we really feel comfortable. Like, and I used to have students, say, what's a safe distance to stand from somebody when you're talking to them. And in America, they'd always say, well, at hand's distance. Well, not really. Like, I want more space. But that's not always the case in other cultures. So I remember I had a student from a different culture who came up and tried talking to me in a room. And, it was somebody, an attractive person from the opposite sex. And they came in and they talked to me. And because their culture says this is normal, they were like right in front of my face. And I didn't know what to think about this. I'm just like, I don't know if I should like give this girl a hug or if I should run away. And so I ran away, kind of. I took a step back. And what did she do? Well, she kept coming forward because like her personal space was being altered because she wasn't comfortable because I was too far away. Whereas me, she was just too close. And so I kept going back and we kept going. We circled the entire room until I was like backed up in a corner because like she wasn't getting the fact that I was sending her really loud message of I'm not comfortable talking to anybody. I don't care what your gender is. I'm not comfortable talking to anybody this close. So please give me more space. But her culture, she was just following the cultural rules saying that, you know what, like if I want to have a serious conversation with somebody, I need to be close enough to them. As you go through this chapter and some of the other readings and videos, pay attention to how they talk about our nonverbal communications and the things that influence them, such as gender, proximity, and culture and all those things. Like, and how do they change the way that we perceive those messages? And I think like the overall goal or something, my takeaway from this chapter is that like the only way I'm going to really understand you and create better relationships with other people is by doing it. Like, I'm not going to understand your smile if I've never seen a smile before. So I've got to put myself out there in the world and start communicating with people, whether it's face to face, through technology, just text messaging, like all of those interactions, you'll create more experiences and start redefining what a smile actually means to you. And you'll be able to interpret the world a little bit better. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you enjoyed the chapter. It's one of my favorite ones, and I think there's a lot that we can learn because, like, going back to how I started this message, is that which type of communication is a lot more powerful, verbal or nonverbal? Obviously, it's nonverbal. Like, you've got to make sure that your nonverbal messages are being perceived and interpreted the way that you want them to be interpreted, so that your words and your nonverbals will align together. And I think when we can do that, you'll be a more effective communicator, a much better leader, and just a better person. I don't know. You're a better communicator. So that's all I got today. So hopefully you have a good weekend and all of that fun stuff. And I will see you next week. Adios.